Civilian areas in Moscow were intentionally and directly targeted in some kind of military operation. Vladimir Putin says that this was the Kiev regime. It was clearly terrorist activity. They used Russian air defense to take out some of these drones. I believe the number may be around a dozen so far, but it looks like war has come to the doorstep of Vladimir Putin. And since the attack on Belgorod, it seems like things are ramping up in Russia. This could be World War III, but there are a lot of finer details that, admittedly, go well beyond me. What I can tell you is that the official corporate line appears to be Russia was attacked, but Kiev was heavily slammed. The propaganda is rising. And the question is, who perpetrated this attack? We don't know. Vladimir Putin clearly says that it was Kiev. But of course, I even tweeted this out a little while ago, I think last week. Vladimir Putin would need a substantial false flag attack to rally the people of Russia into a full-scale war against Ukraine, which it may be, depending on who you ask. Now, Vladimir Putin and the Russian establishment had been saying this is a special military operation for some time. They didn't want to call it a war. At least that's the narrative we're being given. But we know that there are lies across the board from our side, which is the West, whether you agree with them or not. There's Western forces at play and Eastern forces at play. And it may be that you're being fed direct misinformation intentionally so that you will rally to the Ukrainian side. So we don't know. We don't. It's the fog of war, and that will always be the case because there is good reason for every faction to lie about what they're really doing. So it could be that Vladimir Putin staged these drone strikes on his own residential elite areas. But it could be that Kiev targeted these areas specifically so that the establishment elites of Russia would say, Putin, enough, back off. Nobody wants to live this way. And by targeting the people who have the most to lose from this, it would seem the likely culprit is Kiev. If Vladimir Putin was going to stage a false flag attack, I'd imagine he'd target lower class civilian population so that people feel unsafe and would rally behind him, pressuring the elites to agree with him. But by targeting elites, these are the people who are going to go to Putin and say, we just want to be rich. We want to live comfortably. We don't want war. Stop. Because regular people probably aren't going to side with the powerful establishment elites. These are wealthy individuals who are targeted as the wealthier neighborhood. I would say, based on what we've seen so far, it seems like this was an attack on Russia from Kiev, an attempt to push the fight into their territory to weaken their attacks on Ukraine. But let's read the news. I want to show you what appears to be the official narrative line that's descending. Because the way I would report this is much like NBC News has done. Drones strike Moscow in first attack on Russian capital's residential areas since Ukraine war began. I chose this headline because it's the most straightforward in telling you what happened. Now, I'm seeing tons of headlines across the board that are actually saying things like, drones hit Moscow, major strike on Kiev, Ukrainian people scramble and blah, 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 making it reframe the story back onto the people of Ukraine. That seems to be the narrative they want. My friends, let me say this before we start, as we start. If this really was Kiev striking elite areas of Moscow to destabilize their political class and their government, I believe we are inching ever closer to full-scale World War III, direct NATO involvement as opposed to the indirect involvement we're seeing now, and potentially the use of nuclear weapons, which are already said to be on their way to Belarus. We'll see. But Vladimir Putin has already warned that if Russia faces an existential threat, they will use nukes. And he used some metaphors as we will use every asset available, and we all know what that is meant to imply. NBC News reports Moscow was hit by drones Tuesday morning in what appeared to be the first attack on residential areas of the Russian capital since the invasion of Ukraine. It comes weeks after an alleged drone attack on the Kremlin itself and following days of deadly Russian bombardment against civilians in Kiev, as events far from the front lines take the spotlight ahead of Ukraine's planned counteroffensive. Tuesday's incident caused damage to some buildings in Moscow and forced residents to evacuate homes, officials said. Though the Kremlin largely shrugged off the dramatic display that its war was increasingly coming home. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the attack sought to intimidate the public and commended the work of the capital's air defense. The Russian Defense Ministry said in a statement Tuesday night that 8 unmanned aerial vehicles were involved in the strikes. All drones were destroyed. It added, with 3 losing control after being jammed and the other 5 shot down by anti-aircraft systems. Now, I really do have to question the idea of jamming drones. Bro, it's not 10 years ago. It's not 2013. In the early days of drone technology development, just so you know, I was on the front line of this. We were using commercial quadcopter drones for live broadcasting, hacking into these systems to transmit video feeds live over the internet from these drones, something that had not been done before. We successfully used them, and I believe about 2 occasions during Occupy Wall Street to film some of the lesser events. We wanted to steer clear of large groups of people as we were testing this stuff out. I warned. I ended up getting involved in the initial when they were doing trials on drone testing and trying to figure out what are the limitations and what do we need to be worried about. I was on several calls with universities who had been working with the government on how we properly plan for the use of widespread commercial drones. And one of the first things I said was, warfare, be warned. It's not even this. I warned that you will see quadcopter drones, fixed-wing drones, undersea drones, a lot harder to do because they have to remain at the surface for data transmission, because underwater, the signal's not going to come through without a direct line. And I said, look, sooner or later, you are going to see weaponized drones, and I mean soon, and you will not be able to stop them. Now, the argument was made by many people that you could jam drones. And that may have been the case in 2013, that they required a direct signal to control them, and without it, they kind of just aimlessly milled about or landed. Yeah, we've been long past that since 2013. GPS availability in drones allow for them to have pre-programmed flight controls. So I'm curious as to what they mean by jamming them. Are you kidding? They say they 3 lost controls are being jammed? That doesn't sound real. Now, to anybody who doesn't know anything about drone tech, they might say, oh, wow. But for me, I read that and I'm like, what? How? Even back in the day, the drones we had, you could pre-program GPS flight paths. So you'd boot it up. It has a GPS. Theoretically, you could jam their GPS signal. However, when we're talking about, even if it's insurgency, Vladimir Putin saying this is terrorist activity, even at the low level, jamming GPS signal did not mean anything. It's pre-programmed. It's inside. It does not need to connect to GPS and relay information. Once the map was already downloaded, it calculates, how fast am I going? What is my altitude? Therefore, I know where I am. The drone's saying this, I'm pointing out. Basically, you know, when you pull up your phone and it connects to GPS and it shows you moving around, if you disconnect from GPS, the dot goes gray. But the map data is still there. And the drones can still calculate where they are based on how fast they're moving, relative to how fast they were moving. The moment they get a signal, they calculate speed. Jamming them, I don't know, it just seems weird. But to be fair, we may be dealing with low sophistication. We're talking about people in Ukraine being like, strap them up, send them in the air, and fly them forward. And so they don't necessarily have the capabilities. But in my view, if we're dealing with war, and it's an issue of maybe like a few minutes of preloading a program, I just don't understand how this makes sense. Which is to say, maybe false flag. The ministry blamed Ukraine for what it called a terrorist attack. Ukrainian presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak said in an interview that his country had nothing directly to do with the drone attacks on Moscow, but was pleased to observe and predict an increase in the number of attacks. You see, this is the stuff I can't jive with, man. Yo, these were civilian targets. We've got videos. Let me see if I can pull up, what do we have here? Take a look at this video. This is just, there's no injury. There's nothing catastrophic. It's just a video of air defense. So I'll play this now. So that sound you heard was Russian air defense firing at drones, which they say was from a Ukrainian attack. We have this video. Dmitry War Translated tweets, Putin got out of his bunker to say that Moscow air defense operated satisfyingly, stopping the drone attack this morning. Though areas of improvement remain, when it comes to Russia's richest people's houses, it was important for Putin to make a statement and reassure them. He also didn't miss the opportunity to mention Ukrainian nuclear weapons, and even said that Ukraine launched a terror campaign against its own civilians, preventing them from speaking publicly. Here's the challenge, my friends. I can read NBC News, but we are weeks, months, or a year or less away from these videos just being deepfaked. I don't speak Russian. I don't know that what Putin is saying, he's actually saying. All I can do is cross-reference what he's saying with other news outlets who have allegedly done the same thing. Yeah, I know. We could get someone to speak Russian and then tell us, and then we have to trust that person. It's better than nothing. For the time being, I cross-referenced this video with numerous reports and the statements apparently made, and it appears to be that's what the media may be relying on for these statements. So I'm not 100% sure. I don't know. Now I want to show you the media lines and how the media is playing this. Daily Mail, of course, is very pro-war in Ukraine. We saw a video recently. I think people are very upset because RFK Jr. came out in support of Ukraine, favoring the war. Take a look at this Daily Mail article. Ramblings of a madman. Deluded Putin and his cronies accuse Ukraine of, quote, increasingly reckless behavior and terrorism after drone attacks near wealthy Moscow region, despite despot's war killing thousands of innocent people. This is the headline you will see when you pull it up as of the filming of this video. And here's the archive. Or I'm sorry, that's not the archive. Do I have the archive here? Here's the archive. War comes to Putin's doorstep. Wealthy Moscow region is hit by kamikaze drones with blasts within earshot of Vladimir's official residence in revenge for attacks on Ukrainian capital. Very interesting shift in your headline, Daily Mail. But I'm not surprised. We are seeing something similar across the board. The AP headline says, Russia says drones lightly damage Moscow buildings before dawn while Ukraine's capital bombarded. This looks like they're trying to reframe. What we're talking about is between 8 and 12 drone attacks on civilian targets. I think that's the way to frame it. That's the important way to frame it. NBC News, of course, as I chose, is drone strikes Moscow in first attack on Russia's capital's residential areas. I think that's a fair headline. Residential targets. We have this from Yahoo News. Putin responds after Moscow hit with drone attack. And this, of course, where they mention the quote, this is clearly a sign of terrorist activity, seemingly corroborating the video we saw earlier. And we're trying to figure out what's going on. That's the important thing. I think it's important to also point out the media may be lying and manipulating you, and we don't know for sure. NPR says Russia reports several drone strikes on Moscow buildings as Kiev is attacked again. Notice they even try framing it as Kiev is attacked again. It's war. And there's one thing that I think we can take away from this. One, civilians are being targeted in Russia. Vladimir Putin claimed in that statement that they are only targeting military and intelligence targets. They are targeting war. I don't believe him. That doesn't necessarily make sense. When it comes to war, civilian infrastructure very much matters. And that's where scorched earth strategies come from. Oh, let's break this down. Sherman's march to the sea. It's not the advent, but it's around the time we started seeing the modern usage of scorched earth. In the Civil War, Sherman marched to the south and destroyed everything, setting fire to fields and homes, residential areas, civilians. It didn't matter. Why? Who feeds an army? Who funds an army? And that is when it comes to reckless disregard, when it comes to reckless abandon, when it comes to we will win at all costs. Of course, civilian targets are part of war. This is the crazy thing that I think people need to understand. This idea of war crimes is silly nonsense. It's funny when I hear people say like, Vladimir Putin has committed war crimes. Ain't nobody going to try you for a crime if there ain't nobody to try for the crime, right? Take a look at policing in the United States. They say these people are committing crimes, but the cops won't arrest them, the courts won't prosecute, and the jails won't hold them. So does it matter at all? When it comes to Vladimir Putin, war crimes, whatever you want to call it, is attacking civilians in a residential area a war crime? It's meaningless. If Russia wins, then no one's going to bat an eye over quote unquote war crimes. They won. The purpose of the war is absolute victory. Now, you may settle for compromise and a treaty or an armistice or something. But when it comes to warfare, two sides willing to kill each other to gain control of someone, something, some resource, some territory, they don't care what you accuse them of doing. So, of course, one side will always accuse the other of being war criminals. And they'll say, sure. If it comes down to a World War III and Vladimir Putin is the one who wins, history won't record war crimes. It will record a valiant and noble effort on the part of the heroes. History is written by the victors. Now, in this day and age, it's a little bit different. They try to censor, they try to control, but information technology makes it easier than ever to share things, which is where the AI stuff starts getting really scary. What if there were no drone strikes? Why do we believe there were? Well, there are reporters on the ground saying it happened, corroborated by numerous people, videos and photos we can see here in this photo. Shows part of an apartment building which was reportedly damaged by a Ukrainian drone in Moscow. What happens when they start making deepfakes? Remember the Ghost of Kiev, the lie? They posted a video of a fighter flying over Kiev, and they said the Ghost of Kiev, an ace fighter pilot, took out all these Russians. Lies. What else are they lying about? How about when those leaked documents came out saying that Russia hasn't suffered that many casualties? Why would they? But in the West, it sounds like Russian soldiers are being crushed, and all these videos come out of them losing. Reminds me of this time when I went to Korea, and it's a funny story. There was this museum I went to, and they're talking about a great general, a great Korean general fighting the Japanese. And I'm looking at this timeline. It's really funny. It's like the great general defeated the Japanese with 100 ships versus 100 ships. And I'm like, wow, look at that. Then later on, it's like in the second battle, 2 years later, the Korean vessels miraculously defeated with 30 ships against 100 ships. I'm like, wait a minute. Basically, what it looked like was that to tout their famous general, what they were doing was only highlighting the battles he won. And so maybe out of 50 battles, he lost 40, but they highlighted those 10. That's a fair reason to do so. For some reason, there was a victory there, and they can explain how he did it. That's the important part to remember. To be fair, though, it's important to remember why you lost certain battles, too. The point is, in Korea, they were like, he's a great general, and here are the great things he did, despite the fact that they mostly lost. I don't know about him. Someone pointed out, like, he actually was super genius or whatever, and he wasn't involved in the losing battles, so he should have been involved in the victories, in more of the other battles. Something like that. I don't remember. This is what you'll see. When the war ends, are they going to put in the history books their failures and defeats? Of course not. They're going to write about the valiant efforts, how they won and pushed back the West. But the story does not end here, my friends. The targeting of residential buildings presents an existential threat to Russia. That's why I think this likely does come from Kiev. Wealthy Russians were targeted. These are the people of means and influence who are now going to go say to the government, stop this now. There's no easy way out. If the wealthy elites, who in most countries control things, go to Putin or go to anyone else and say, we need to end this. Maybe they want a coup. Maybe they petition Putin himself and say, it's time to stop this. We just want to be rich. You think Putin's going to be like, okay, I'll give up? Or do you think he's going to say, the targeting of residents, civilians in our nation's capital is a red line. You now pose an existential threat to Russia for which we will stamp out. There's a lot to wonder. The use of strategic nuclear weapons or nuclear artillery on Ukrainian targets. Perhaps the fear that in doing so would trigger a greater escalation in which the West would then retaliate in kind. And then Russia would really lose. Or if they use nuclear weapons, would the West then rally the world against Russia to a degree Russia could not handle? Don't look at me. I don't know. All I can tell you is the war has escalated to a very, very dangerous point. And I think we've never been closer to full-scale nuclear war. Nay, it may already be happening, with the UK deploying depleted uranium tank-busting shells, which Russia says are nuclear weapons. It doesn't have to be when it comes to nuclear weapons. Massive ICBMs. There are many different ways to do it. A dirty bomb, for instance. What if one of these drones carries a dirty bomb? A small bomb that detonates and spreads radioactive materials, contaminating an area and forcing evacuations. What then? We're entering dangerous territory here. The psychotic behavior of our leaders funding and supporting this war in Ukraine, it's insane. RFK said something like, we support them because we're good people. Yeah, I think we're good people. I don't think the establishment's good people. I don't think Vladimir Putin's a good person. I think it's war. And I think they're marching us down something dangerous. It's a hard gamble. The idea that if you let Vladimir Putin push around the world and threaten the use of hot war, then why would he stop here? It's a fair point. You got to call his bluff. But if he ain't bluffing, then the world ends. And is that really the path we want to go down? Are we holding the cards needed? I'm not so sure. Because we keep betting. But Vladimir Putin may just say, okay, look, here's the nuke. And that's the main thing. The question isn't whether or not Putin has the cards. The question is he willing to risk it all for them? The scary thing is I think he is. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 4 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you all then.